Okay, my presentation tonight is titled What Keith Taught Me About Power on Board. So we all know Keith Stamper. Keith is a very generous guy and an early adopter of Power on Board, something that I was quite interested in. So yeah, Keith was an early adopter of Power on Board and very generously took an entire day to help me convert K37, an ON3 K37 to Power on Board. So let's see what Keith taught me about Power on Board. What's the appeal? Well, you get rid of all of your track wiring, locomotive pickup issues, no more cleaning rail or wheels for electrical connectivity. There's no full layout electrical or electronic issues and no full layout DCC system issues or system period. Simplifies track construction, no gaps or insulators. And your locomotives are portable to other layouts, be they DCC, two-rail DC, PFM, or other dead rail layouts. So the option that Keith selected and that I followed along with is the air wire system. It's common amongst the G-scale crowd. The components are readily available and quite robust. And basically it consists of a multi-frequency radio transmitter, the throttle, that communicates with a receiver in the locomotive. It's that simple. So this is the throttle. There's 17 frequency settings. It's quite an ergonomic throttle, speed control, reverse, the numbered keypad, the all-important escape key, the menu key, the accessory key, which I have no idea what that does. I've never used it. You can store locomotives in memory and do consist. So it's a very ergonomic and intuitive throttle. And this is the radio receiver in the locomotive and the antenna that receives the signal. So like I said, it's that simple. Well, sort of. This is the way I divide things out. The decoder and the speaker are in the locomotive. And then within the tender is the air wire receiver. There's a little switchboard that controls the electronics, whether the engine's on or off, charging or using battery power, and then the battery in the tender. So we'll go through a few of the important things about this kind of installation. So if we just jump right in and start with the little switchboard, this is the switchboard. It's a commercially available item adapted for dead rail applications, and it comes with a wiring diagram. And this is the little reed switch for turning the locomotive on and off. One thing to keep in mind is that polarity is important to the battery, the charging jack, and the air wire converter. I use red and black wires to keep things orderly. And that little reed switch is exceptionally fragile, so it takes a fair bit of care for the installation. So just a bit more on the reed switch. This little diagram represents the reed switch with the leads on each end. I bend the leads, solder wires on either end. Make sure you apply a heat sink when you're soldering. You don't want to overheat the glass reed switch. And then when that's all done, I slip over a piece of heat shrink tubing and just heat shrink it on the ends, and that's kind of like a protective sleeve for the reed switch, and that gets ACC to the inside of the back of the tender, or really wherever you want it during assembly. Another thing to think about is planning your wiring, adding a number of plugs to facilitate locomotive disassembly and maintenance. When I want to take a locomotive apart, I don't want major assemblies connected together by a wire. I want a little plug in there so I can disconnect everything. Again, you need to pay careful attention to polarity where it's required. The types of plugs that I use, I extend the red paint right to the end of the plug so that it's really, really clear which way the polarity goes for plugging them back in. Just a note about battery powered locomotives. It's from a safety perspective, it's really important that any potentially live connection terminates in a female plug. You don't want the battery terminating in a male plug like that. You could short it out very easily, and those batteries have quite a lot of stored energy. Bad things would happen. So charging port on the tender. If your tender doesn't have a working water hatch, just modify it to add one, easy peasy. If you're working with an MMI locomotive, the K36 and K37 actually have removable water hatch lids. They're just more or less painted in place, so you can persuade them open. I use a piece of this drilled electronics board. It probably has a name, but I don't know what its name is, as a base for the charging plug. And again, apply paint so that you know the correct polarity. So just working our way through installing the components in the tender. This photograph here, what we're looking at is a tender body separated from the tender frame and turned upside down. So we're looking inside the tender body and fit the components in as best you can. This is the little board with the charging plug under the water hatch. Here's our little reed switch mounted on the back of the tender, and the air wire converter mounted on the side of the tender. I use double-sided Gorilla brand clear tape to hold things in place. It's a pretty good tape, holds well, but it's also removable if you make a mistake. And I just want to point out the antenna, nice and straight. You don't want any loops or curves in the antenna at all. That will affect range. Looking on the other side of the that same tender, this is the switchboard mounted, and then here's a plug. This is the plug that connects to the battery, so of course it's not live, so it's the male plug. Really important to plan out your location of your male and female plugs. So I just want to make a note here about batteries and chargers. If you're considering power on board, do not go it alone. Make sure you work with someone reputable that really knows batteries and the appropriate charger to use for power on board applications. Never exceed the recommended charging amperage on a battery. So based on expert recommendation, I use high quality lithium polymer batteries. These are instrument grade batteries, and yes, they cost more. Never buy a radio control grade battery. They're not safe for indoor use. You can find a much cheaper battery online. My recommendation is you don't buy it. So let's finish up with the tender installation. So sometimes the battery is the elephant in the room. This is an 800 milliamp hour lithium polymer battery. And of course, it's potentially live, so it terminates in a female plug that's the plug that goes to the locomotive. And this is an ON3 K27 tender, just for rough size comparison. Now we get to the engine installation. Pretty straightforward speaker installation and decoder installation in an MMI K27. Won't really go into the ins and outs of decoder installation. But again, these plugs are important. The male plug from the decoder to the tender, when it's disconnected, it's never live, so it has to be a male plug. The plug from the decoder to the motor is potentially live because the tender could be connected, so it has to be a female plug. So just safety first. Just a note about speakers. I like putting speakers in the locomotive. I like it when the locomotive sounds come out of the locomotive. If you can, double up the baffle to improve the lower end sound on the speaker. And there's usually room behind the smoke box front for a large speaker in most brass models. Sometimes you open the smoke box front and you find a detailed smoke box interior in there. I just take that out to make room for the speaker. So now setting up your engine, once you've converted it to power on board, I remove the driver pickups that eliminates potential maintenance issues and rotate the tender trucks 180 degrees. That helps prevent your new power on board locomotive from shorting out a DCC layout when visiting. That would be the height of that form, I guess. Setting the control variables on the decoder. There's a bunch of options. You can enter them directly from the AirWire throttle. That's quite tedious. You can use Decoder Pro with a DCC interface, or you can do a hybrid of the above. I do a hybrid. I have a hybrid approach to that. So a programming track is a non-option for obvious reasons. Here's my DCC interface, laptop on the left, loaded with Decoder Pro, what I call the black box, because I never touch anything on it, in the middle, and then plugged into the locomotive. So you need a reasonably up-to-date laptop, current version of Java, and current version of Decoder Pro. So what is this black box? I've got an NCE power cab. That's a whole DCC system in one handheld throttle. And it's mounted on a box. There's a wall plug, a computer USB cable interface, and a plug to the locomotive. So inside the black box is the NCE USB adapter and layout fascia plug that comes with the power cab. So setting the control variables, you can set most of them using Decoder Pro and then do fine tuning with the AirWire throttle. And for me, that's usually speed matching using CVs 66 and 95. I do speed match my locomotives because I want to operate them in multiple units. And that's an iterative process. You need to try it guess at it 3 or 4 times, but then you can get them pretty close. Calibrate the dynamic digital exhaust, fine-tuning some sound levels, and occasionally I have to fix a few flubs from the Decoder Pro work. And you can download the final CV settings to Decoder Pro if you want. I generally don't do that. And then for charging locomotives, I call this my portable EV charging station. I've got 3 chargers and 3 long flexible leads. And I just take it around the layout to where the locomotives are and charge the locomotives in situ. I don't lift them off the layout or have a special charging area or anything. I just take the charger to where the locomotives are. So we've talked about working with a reputable supplier for batteries, and I just want to put a plug in for my preferred supplier for all of these items. Old Iron Designs. Jeff Ringley is the principal of the company, and you can get installation kits for do-it-yourself power on board installations. Jeff will work with you to come up with the required parts list and items to do that. But he also does custom installations for steam and diesel in 1/48 scale, so ON3, 2-rail, and Proto 48. I've seen many of his installations, and they are outstanding. So just a quick note about some reference material. On the left-hand side, the AirWire converter manual is outstanding. It's well written. It's got wiring diagrams, troubleshooting diagrams. The AirWire throttle manual, again, is outstanding, really well written. You know, you're going to spend a couple of weeks of evenings reading and digesting these things, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty robust. And then, of course, the Tsunami user and reference guides, and then the manuals for the NCE system. Thankfully, I've never cracked those open. My black box does its black box thing, and I've never had to learn any more about the DCC system. So I just wrap up with some conclusions. Overall, I'm pleased with the AirWire system and power on board overall. I've converted my ON3 locomotives and my O standard gauge locomotives to power on board. That's 21 locomotives in all to date. The locomotives perform on a single charge for a 3 to 4 hour operating session with no interruption. Double heading and triple heading is easy to do. And the locomotives do hold their charge for months with no substantial diminishment of the charge. Before I go on to a parts list, I want to just talk about some recent developments. So the new Soundtrax Blunami Bluetooth-enabled decoder has the potential to enhance power on board. Using a Blunami instead of a TSU 2200, for example, allows the use of the Soundtrax software to set and read the control variables. So it eliminates the need for Decoder Pro and a DCC system or my black box. And as well, the engine can be controlled from either an iPad, an iPhone, or the AirWire throttle. If you want to take that a step further, you could eliminate the AirWire throttle and the converter receiver and just control the locomotive directly from an iPad or an iPhone. Keith Stamper has done that on a recent conversion in SN3. I'm not sure I'm ready to go with a touchpad for controlling the locomotives, but I think if they developed Bluetooth-enabled throttle, that would be an improvement. So I'll just kind of leave the parts list on here for people to contemplate. The logical question is, how much does all this cost? The premium for power on board as compared to a conventional decoder installation is about $175 per locomotive. So when you think of not needing a DCC system, not needing to wire your layout, all of those kind of things, maybe it makes sense. It did make sense to me, and I'm happy with it. And I just want to give one more shout out to Keith and say thanks for all of his mentoring and the time that he spent with me on this adventure. Okay.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate that, Jeff. I've been looking at the chat for any questions, Jeff, and I added a comment. You were talking about that board where you mounted the charging plug. I would call that perf board, short for perforated board. It's a special kind of the breadboard you use for prototyping circuits. Yeah. So perf board, I think, is what you're using. Yeah. Makes
sense. I'm a mechanical engineer, so I don't really know much about that kind of stuff.
Trust me, I think you know more. In that case, you know more than I do. So okay. And Dan Stenger says the Blunami software is now available for Android as well as for iPhone.
So that's good news.
Yep.
I could drag out my old BlackBerry and use that to control my trains.
You might be stretching it a bit there, but that's a good Canadian piece of kit, the BlackBerry. I know that's another Toronto thing. And Bill Hobbs says, I bought my first Blunami a couple of weeks ago. I like the transponding capabilities, so you can see the CVs easily. He uses a different controller except for just demonstrating it, and he started working with battery control about 12 years ago, working with the Stanton SCAB system. So he has both DC powered locomotives and battery powered ones. So a bit of a hybrid setup from Bill Hobbs. So yeah, I think Blunami adds a lot to this. It's great you mentioned that towards the end. It really probably makes a lot of this stuff easier.